Good evening. I'm Jim Zirin, and you are watching The Digital Age. With us tonight is Richard Haass. Richard Haass is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and everyone is talking about Richard's new book. It is entitled Foreign Policy Begins at Home, the case for putting America's house in order. In the book, Richard argues that if we are to retain our primacy in the world as a leader of the world, we have to clean our domestic house, if not first, then simultaneously. Richard, we're delighted to have you with us.
Great to be back.
Now, Katie Couric calls your book a hot read for the summer. I'm not so sure it's a hot read. I'm not so sure what she means, but it is certainly an emphasis on domestic priorities. And last I checked, you're a dues-paying member of the foreign policy establishment.
Absolutely.
And is this mission creep? I mean, why did you write a book like this?
Well, the intellectual answer would be that national security it's a coin with two sides, and there's the traditional foreign policy side, but there's also the domestic policy side, the economic, the social, the educational, what have you. Unless we have the resources, we're not going to be able to act, much less lead in the world. The other answer is in some ways a more personal one, which is when I look at what the United States has been doing in the world and doing, but also not doing at home, I'm genuinely worried about the capacities we have and are putting into place. And it brings me to the same point that universities may have departments, Jim. You may have a Department of Economics and a Department of Government. The world doesn't have departments. We've got to have our house in order here at home if we're essentially going to be in a position to try to put the world in order overseas.
So what are the major problems at home that we need to fix and fix fast?
Well, more than anything else, it begins with the economic. We're growing, as you know, at roughly half to two-thirds the historic rate after World War II. So we've got to jack up U.S. economic growth. Related to that are all sorts of things. We've got to do something about the looming entitlement crisis. The short run, we're okay, but the medium to long run, we have a set of obligations that we are simply unable to meet. The only way we can ever begin to meet them is by scaling back, scaling down those obligations, particularly in the health area, to some extent in Social Security. We've got to do something about our schools. Very few people line up at American consulates around the world to come to American K through 12 schools. They want to go to Princeton or Harvard or Stanford. It's not for the average PS in New York City or anywhere else. We've got to do something about our infrastructure. Anyone watching this who's recently flown in and out of Kennedy or Newark or LaGuardia or taken the train to Washington, I don't need to say anything more. American infrastructure is third world. Actually, it's not even that. Many countries in the third world now have better infrastructure than we do. It's a tremendous time waste. It makes us inefficient. Also makes us more vulnerable in some ways to terrorism. We're not as resilient as we need to be. Immigration. We've got to make it possible for more high-skilled people to come into this country and to stay here. So these are just some of the things we can and should do.
And what is the problem with our doing this? Why don't we address our problems? Have we become totally dysfunctional?
You've answered the question. In virtually all of these areas, what's missing is not the intellectual answer. If you and I sat down, we could, on the back of a napkin, whether it was education or immigration or economic growth, what have you, we could lay out a series of propositions that would leave us better off. The problem is increasingly our politics won't allow it. We have special interests that crowd out the general interest. Look at the area of entitlements. The AARP has, 35, 40 million members? The AARP opposes anything that begins to be remotely sensible in the area of entitlement reform. So the special interest is simply too powerful. So we've got a real problem in American politics. Obviously, the Congress is dysfunctional in many ways. We're more partisan than we've ever been before. With all due respect, the media is often part of the problem. We now narrowcast more than broadcast, so rather than having the media create a sense of common information or common understanding, it tends to reinforce people's prejudices. So I think that's part of the reality. I'd also fault some of our presidents. And there's areas I support the current president, but I don't think he has led either at the macro level, some of what you might call the wholesale approach to leadership, and then you've also got to be retail. He never should have lost, I would argue, the vote on gun control. If you have 90% of the American people preferring some version of background checks, then you really have to ask yourself, why can't you translate that into a majority in the United States Senate?
But we're not losing our primacy in the world because we don't have a vigorous or robust gun control regime. We're losing it basically because of a loss of economic power, isn't that right?
Partially economic power. I'd also say that what we're doing in the world, we've also lost, we lost some support. I think we've overreached in places like Afghanistan, in places like Iraq. People have come to question what it is we're doing and how we're doing it. But actually, I want to circle back. I actually think things like gun control matter. Foreign policy is about more than what our diplomats say or what our soldiers do. It's the example we set. So after 2008, when economically the United States failed to regulate itself, that had all sorts of direct implications for the rest of the world economically, but also raised fundamental questions about the American economic model. When our politics don't function, it makes it very hard for us to say, hey, you out there, you ought to become more democratic like we are, when our democracy is seen as unresponsive. The fact that over the last few years, you've seen the rise of the so-called Asian model, the Singapore, China. People are talking about that as in some ways preferable to the democratic capitalist model. Well, that tells you something. People are looking at what we're doing and how we're doing it, and they do have questions about our performance.
Well, there's a real question. If in China they want a new airport because the existing one is decaying, they just build a new airport. They don't need to go to Congress, and they don't need to have funds appropriated, and they don't need to get into a political battle.
That's the advantage of China. The disadvantage of China is the system isn't self-correcting. So you may get that new airport, but in the way, you may confiscate all sorts of land, which angers and alienates your people. You don't give them a sense of participation and due process. In the course of building it, you may cause all sorts of environmental havoc, and on and on and on. China is not 10 feet tall. China has tremendous internal challenges. For what it's worth, I don't think the authoritarian Chinese or Singapore model is the right or preferable answer. I do think it is the democratic capitalist model, but we've got to make it work. It's not that theirs is better, it's that ours is underperforming.
Now, you mentioned Afghanistan, and Obama ran for president in 2008 on the plank that he would get us out of Afghanistan. Since he's been in office, he added 30,000 troops, and which cost us untold billions of dollars, as well as the loss of human capital. Are you critical of him because of that?
There's actually much about Mr. Obama's foreign policy I like. I like the so-called pivot or rebalance towards Asia. I like the fact that he's showing some discipline in what we're not doing, so to speak, in the Middle East. My biggest single beef with him was the decision to triple U.S. force levels in Afghanistan, to essentially get ambitious there. He himself was walking it back. We're now on the downward slope. I hope we don't get out completely. I actually would support a modest residual force in that country. Indeed, I wish he had done that in Iraq. I don't think the answer is to get out entirely, but I do think he made a mistake in Afghanistan, which was to get ambitious, to try to remake that country. It went against its local traditions, and I don't think we will ever have results, quite honestly, that will be commensurate with what it is we've invested in the way of lives or dollars or time.
Now, you spoke of the pivot toward Asia, and I guess pivot's a basketball term, but I mean, the implication is you give up one interest in favor of another.
Yeah, that's why I don't like the term. It's too sharp. I like rebalance or adjustment, essentially to slightly dial down what we've done in the Middle East. I think there's an understanding that for the last 10 to 20 years, the Middle East has assumed so central a role in American foreign policy that it's quite honestly out of whack. It's distorted our approach to the world, and that we need to dial up a little bit in Asia. That's where the great powers are. But it's also not simply where our interests are. It's where the tools we have to bring to bear actually make sense. Negotiating a new trade agreement, backing our allies, negotiating or consulting with China, having more air and naval presence. The United States is actually extraordinarily well suited to promote its very important, indeed vital national interests in the Asia Pacific. I would actually say in the Middle East, our interests are less, but more important, our ability to affect or influence those interests is decidedly less.
Now, Obama is scheduled to meet shortly in California with the president of China. And they say no talking points. They're just going to hug each other and sing Kumbaya or something. But personal diplomacy. What do you think they should be talking about?
I love the idea that they're not using talking points. That gets staid and stale real fast. I'm also, though, often uneasy with personal diplomacy. virtually every American president falls prey to this idea that he can just, his chemistry can work with this foreign leader, whether it was FDR, with Stalin, or everybody since. And that tends to be exaggerated. Charm does not get you that far when it comes to foreign policy. What I would like to see with the China, though, are really wide-ranging talks on everything, from the bilateral to the regional to the global. Look, this relationship has all sorts of challenges, but on the other hand, if you think about it, it hasn't done so badly. It was forged in a very different geopolitical era. It was forged in the context of the Cold War, and what the United States and China had in common was simply their shared opposition to the Soviet Union. The problem was that rationale ended in 1989 when the wall came down. That's now 24 years ago. So the United States and China have been struggling to come up with a new foundation, a new compass, if you will, for their relationship for several decades. And we've stumbled through different things. Particularly, we've developed the economic side. Well, the economic side is now as much a source of friction as it is of anything positive. But also, there's a whole set of issues that we've got to deal with. Obviously, the new geopolitics of Asia. We've got to deal with this whole issue of cyberspace. What is permissible activity? What is not? How are we going to deal with global challenges from climate change to health issues, what have you? So the U.S.-Chinese agenda needs to evolve. The mechanisms in place are just that. They're too mechanical. So it's important that the president and the Chinese leader, Mr. Xi, that they can put into place the beginnings of what you might call a real strategic set of exchanges over the next 3.5 years.
Should North Korea be on the agenda?
Absolutely. And it's in the Chinese interest that North Korea be on the agenda. China, I think, now understands that North Korea is much more of a burden than it is of an asset. And if the Chinese are worried about the political and military trajectory of South Korea and Japan, they only need look so far as North Korea. This is what's going to cause those countries, as much as anything, to become much more assertive, to even rethink the so-called nuclear taboo. So China has to figure out ways to use the influence it denies it has. It has to use the influence it does have with North Korea to rein in their behavior.
Now, the pivot, of course, suggests that there be a dialed-down involvement in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And the president suggested as much in his speech a couple of weeks ago at the National Defense College. Now, do you endorse the position he took? I mean, that's really consistent with what you say in the book.
Very much so. Very much so. I don't think the war on terrorism is ever going to end, at least in our lifetimes. But the general thrust, the counterterrorism, should be part of our foreign policy, but should not form, if you will, the basic structure of it. I agree with that. And more fundamentally, as you suggest in your question, that we can't have the greater Middle East so dominate what America does in the world. Again, our interests there don't warrant it. But more important even is that our ability to influence what interests we have, I think, is quite limited. Even if the United States were to do more in many of these situations, I don't think there would be more to show for it.
Okay, so now Tom Donilon has resigned as National Security Advisor. The president has appointed Susan Rice, or is about to. Mm-hmm. Susan Rice is a known interventionist. Do you think that brings us closer to intervening in Syria?
At the end of the day, it's going to be the president's policy, not Susan Rice's policy or John Kerry's policy or Chuck Hagel's policy. I would simply say that before we intervene directly in Syria militarily, we really got to ask ourselves two questions. What are we likely to accomplish there? Not just in terms of getting rid of potentially the current government, but then in making a stable, viable society afterwards. What are we going to accomplish? What it would cost? We really need to think that through, what would be the direct cost, but also if we were to do all that, even if we were to succeed, which I doubt, but even if we were to succeed, what would be the indirect or opportunity costs? What would it mean for what we need to do in Asia? Or coming back to the theme of my book, what would it mean to what it is we would be able to do at home? A president only has so much bandwidth. A country only has so much in the way of resources. So if we want to get ambitious in Syria, we had really better look hard at the prospects, the costs. And one of the lessons of Vietnam, of Iraq, and Afghanistan is that local realities matter. So in Washington, we can have all the debates we want about humanitarian intervention, but people had better look awfully hard at the real mechanics, if you will, the DNA of Syrian society. What is it the United States could accomplish in a lasting, enduring way? Not simply to get rid of Mr. Assad's regime, but what are you going to do to get the Alawites and the Sunnis of Syria to live together? What are you going to do within the Sunni world so the quote-unquote moderates to coexist with the far more radical? How is it you're basically going to, once you get rid of put Humpty Dumpty back together again? So what I don't hear from the interventionists is their end game. It's fine to say we've got to go in and stop the genocide. I understand that.
But how would we go in? How can we stop the genocide without boots on the ground? How can we stop genocide without deploying the United States Air Force?
Well, frankly, I'm skeptical, and no-fly zones and the rest wouldn't do it. Lots would happen on the ground. Indeed, it reminds me of the debates we used to have about Iraq. You would have to get in on the ground, and that's an enormous, enormous undertaking that I would fundamentally oppose. The one area I would do more is if we're not going to get in directly militarily, which I think is correct, we should not, then I would say we should do more indirectly. Not simply to help the refugees, not simply to shore up the neighbors like Jordan and Turkey, but I would be willing to provide lethal aid to those elements of the opposition whose agendas we could live with.
Lethal aid is arms for the rebels. Now, which rebels do we give arms to?
Well, obviously, you've got to vet them. That's why we have something called the CIA. That's why we have these people in the Defense Department who have these kinds of relationships. And we don't know all of them. And I'm not saying there wouldn't be risks. Some of these arms would get into the wrong hands. But you've got imperfect, you've got flawed options. And I would say the least bad option at this point would be to provide anti-air and different types of anti-armor capabilities to elements of the Syrian opposition.
Well, peace talks have, I guess, tentatively been scheduled. I don't know what rebels are going to participate in the peace talks. There'll probably be rebels who aren't doing the fighting, who have no power.
Those talks are going nowhere. Indeed, I'll be honest with you, at the risk of being blasphemous, I don't even think the meeting should take place. What worries me is you could have a situation where the regime and the Russians could say, let's have a ceasefire. No, we're not, the opposition is not going to accept a ceasefire in place. They want the regime to go. So what? So we set up a set of peace talks that not only fail, but make the regime and their backers look good. They can pose as the defenders of peace, whereas the people we're supporting to one degree or another look like they're against peace. I think this is a terrible idea.
And what about Iran? Iran is now, there are a lot of stakeholders now in this country, if it is a country. Still, you have the Russians who have an enormous investment, I guess, which they're trying to protect. And you have the Iranians and Hezbollah. And,
sure. This has now become a regional war within a country.
And a sectarian conflict.
Absolutely. At its core, it's sectarian, but now you have this overlay of outsiders coming in. So there's strategic stakes as well as humanitarian stakes. So again, I want to shore up the neighbors, so hopefully this doesn't spread, and I want to do more to help the opposition. But I also want to put a limit on what we do, because I don't think by doing more we'd have more to show for it, and we got a lot else to worry about. That's why I think it's important we be strategic here. We don't want to go all in Syria, if you will, because that would be strategically, to me, myopic.
Now, are we on the wrong side in supporting the opposition? The Russians say Assad is winning. He just won a major victory on the ground.
It's a long struggle. No, we're not on the wrong side, but I do think we should do more for the side we're supporting.
More for the rebels?
Yes, sir.
Whoever they are. Let's move on to another Mideastern country that's having some difficulties. You recently returned from Turkey. What's happening there?
What you're beginning to see is some pushback against the ruling parties, the AKP party, which has consolidated power over the last 10, 11 years. They've introduced Islam in more fundamental, pervasive ways into the society. They've obviously weakened or all but eliminated the political role of the military. They've intimidated some business leaders. They've jailed a lot of journalists. And what you've had is a dispute that took place over this allocation of land, one of the main squares in Istanbul, but it's not about that. It was simply the trigger. And what you're having is pushback against what's seen as an authoritarian, majoritarian leadership by people who are more secular, who are younger, and who are worried about the trajectory of Turkish society.
Well, Erdogan seems drunk with power. He has a particularly...
It's an ironic image given that
right.
alcohol use has taken on a symbolic import there.
That's right. He's introduced that, and he's put dissidents in jail and claiming that that secular expressions were blasphemous, and he's taken on a world-class musician.
Sure.
Who tweeted something that he said defamed Islam.
He has not absolute power, but he has considerable power. The opposition parties are feckless. And the real politics, to the extent they now take place within Turkey, is within the ruling party. Now, for those who are not members of the ruling party, they feel the only outlet they've got is the streets, which is why we're seeing what we're seeing. But this is a battle, if you will, over the future of Turkey.
Well, he, of course, was democratically elected.
Absolutely.
But Stephen Cook says it's a hollow democracy.
Well, the checks and balances are getting fewer and weaker, and that's, again, what's worrisome. And that's why I think people now are making something of a stand. It'll be very interesting to see how both sides react. Does Mr. Erdogan escalate? Does he compromise? And obviously, for the people in the squares and in the streets, do they press?
And you think we're seeing a Turkish spring?
Too soon? The answer is I don't know, but there is a sense, particularly because the Constitution's being redrafted, and people are worried it's going to strengthen the role of the presidency. Mr. Erdogan would then segue into the presidency. So there are people in Turkey who think now is the moment to try to prevent Turkey reaching a point where power is so consolidated that there's nothing you can do about it. So I don't know if we're going to reach a Turkish spring, but we could reach something of a showdown.
Now, you've written that the Middle East is a place where our interests perhaps exceed our influence. And if we're to talk of the Middle East, of course, the overriding question is, what about Israel? Do you see any hope for getting the peace talks back on track?
I'd say two
Palestinians?
things. I see very little hope. I once wrote in your earlier book about ripeness and about whether the prerequisites of a successful negotiation were in place. I don't see it. Egypt, one of the countries Israel has a treaty with, is obviously now run by the Muslim Brothers. Jordan's future is a little bit uncertain. Iran is potentially developing nuclear weapons. Palestinians are still split. The Israeli government at the moment is a coalition government that was forged not to negotiate peace, but to change the role of Orthodox Jews within Israeli society. So I don't think you've got the elements of diplomatic progress. But even if I'm wrong, and I'd love to be wrong, and imagine you did have some diplomatic progress, that would be great. It'd be good for Israelis, it would be good for Palestinians. I don't think it would unlock, if you will, any of the other problems we're talking about in the Middle East. For so long, many Americans and others have said, if only you could solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem, everything else would fall into place. No. It would be good for Israelis and Palestinians, but it would not change the dynamics fundamentally in Syria. It would not change the dynamics within Iraq, which is getting rougher around the edges. It would not fundamentally affect Iran's quest for nuclear weapons or the struggle for legitimacy within Egypt.
Or the sectarian conflict between Shia and Sunni.
Absolutely. That is now the most powerful dynamic in the Middle East. So the idea, again, that the Israeli-Palestinian dispute is somehow central to the region's future, no, it's important. And again, neither Israelis nor Palestinians benefit from the status quo. Indeed, in the long run, both would benefit tremendously from progress, so don't get me wrong. I think it's an important goal for American foreign policy, but in no way is it central right now to the future of the region.
And what really is our policy toward Iran? I mean, the president drew what he called a red line concerning chemical weapons and the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Then it appears that chemical weapons have been used, probably by Assad. Not clear to what extent. Yeah. Certainly the British and French say it was used by the regime. And still we've done nothing, although we have a new national security advisor who may be inclined to do something. Does that hurt our credibility when we tell the Iranians we're going to not contain them after they get the bomb, but we're going to prevent them from getting the bomb? And that's kind of a red line.
Got to be mindful of it, and we have drawn that line with the Iranians. Just this last week, the United States ratcheted up the sanctions against Iran. You're going to have an Iranian new elections very shortly, a new Iranian government. I think there'll be a big diplomatic push, and we'll see. And either this combination of sanctions and diplomacy will persuade the Iranians to show some flexibility, to essentially park their nuclear program at a level that's enough for them, but not too much for us, or it won't, in which case this administration will have to make what could be its most fateful foreign policy choice, which is whether to live with an Iran that has nuclear weapons or to launch a preventive military attack against it. Either one of those options, essentially a containment or a preventive strike, I think is costly, risky, uncertain. And that's why, again, it makes so much sense for the administration to try through diplomacy and sanctions to avoid having to make that choice.
So which is scarier, if Iran gets the bomb or if they don't get the bomb?
They are both, to me, extraordinarily frightening. And what I lay out in the book is a number of questions that we need to answer before we could make an informed decision. But this is going to be a close call if we ever have to make it. And either way, it could be extraordinarily expensive.
we've just about run out of time, but I have a question for you, Richard Haass. How much time do we have to clean our house domestically if we're going to retain our primacy in the world?
Good news is we have a little bit of time and space, in part because so many of the other countries in the world, including China, face a raft of domestic challenges. The problem is the world won't really wait for us, so I see it over the next decade. The reason I say that is I'm looking at the looming entitlement obligations. That, to me, is the big overhang over the United States. So I would say roughly the next 8 to 10 years, plus or minus, the United States needs to deal with the entitlement obligation challenge and needs to rekindle higher rates of economic growth.
So time is running out, 8 to 10 years.
It is not
Richard Haass, thank you so much for coming by. This has been just marvelous. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more about the digital age. Please visit our website at www.digitalage.org. For the Digital Age, I'm Jim Zirin. Good night and all the best.